Our next speaker is Taraneh Zarin, who is a grad student at the U of T and is active in the Free Transit Toronto movement.
Hi everyone, thanks for showing up here tonight. So as Herman said, I'm with Free Transit Toronto, which is a campaign for free and accessible public transit in Toronto. We're a small but dedicated group of volunteer organizers who believe in a simple concept that fare free public transit should be a right for everyone, like libraries, public education, and healthcare. Our actions are focused on introducing the idea of free public transit to the people of Toronto, and most of us are involved in and lend support to other movements in the city that focus on anti-privatization, freezing and reduction of transit fares, and anti-poverty measures. Some of the groups that members of our group work with are TTC Riders, the Fair Fare Coalition, which is now part of TTC Riders, and JFAP, or Jane Finch Action Against Poverty. And if you're interested in any more background about our group, or you want to read some of the literature that we've produced, please visit freetransittoronto.org, join our Facebook group, follow us on Twitter at FreeTransitTO. So first I'm just going to tell you about why free public transit is a good idea, and then I'll tie it in a bit more to the electoral issues that we're talking about. So we know that people face many barriers to riding public transit, and one of the major barriers is undoubtedly the fare, or the entrance fee, which penalizes those with low or no incomes. We recently, some of the members of our group, attended a meeting at City Hall based around the transportation portion of the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy. One of the people we heard from was Beely So, an elderly person who walks up to 6 hours a day because she can't afford TTC fares. And this is not an exceptional story. So a TTC Metro Pass costs $146 and change, and is one of the most expensive transit passes in the world. A senior student or the recently won low income pass offers a measly $30 discount per month, bringing the cost down to about $116. So this is a huge purchase to make every month, and most people don't have a choice but to make cuts to other parts of their lives to accommodate it. And so you can consider how incredible it would be to have universal mobility paid for by progressive taxes that do not penalize those with low incomes. A related point for free public transit is that of decommodification. So currently when you ride the TTC, you're referred to as a customer. And sadly, this somewhat makes sense with the current fare structure of the TTC, because you're literally paying at the point of entry for the product of moving from one place to another. I don't know about you, but whenever I'm considering riding the TTC somewhere, I'm doing a lot of mental math to see if it's worth it. Is the product that I'm paying for worth the $3? What about on the way back? Should I spend that $6 on food? And so you can see that there's a lot of energy spent on trying to decide if you should move from one place to another. So let's imagine that you live in Etobicoke, you want to get to Scarborough for some reason. You have to factor in that, well, I didn't mean it that way. That's not what I meant. I meant that you can, I'll leave it up to you to imagine why you want to go there. Maybe there's an event, maybe you're there for a job interview, maybe you're unemployed and you're trying to figure out how many job interviews you can afford to go to. So public transit fares directly affect our mobility and thereby our social, educational, and economic opportunities, our understanding of our city. So if you live in Etobicoke and you've never been to Scarborough, or maybe you can only get there a couple times a year, and thereby our understanding of our fellow people who live in our city. We have to be able to move around, and it's not fair if the most privileged of us have the most buying power when it comes to mobility. So free public transit is a key step in making mobility more equitable. And I'm sure we can all agree that mobility is not a frill, and we believe it should be a right for all of us. So it's pretty clear that free public transit would result in a surge in ridership, which is another pro for free public transit. And we've seen evidence of this in other cities. For example, in Tallinn, Estonia, which is the largest city in the world that has free public transit. And in fact, this has been so successful in Tallinn that the Estonian government has now expanded this to the entire country, making it the largest free transit zone in the world. And of course, we have to mention that with a surge in ridership will come a reduced dependence on private motor vehicles, which is a key component of the fight against climate change, as well as the often talked about gridlock that our city and every other city faces. So there's no question that public transit is the answer to sustainable mobility, especially in cities. Finally, free public transit means no fare police. Fare inspectors would be abolished, of course, under free public transit. People would not worry about being harassed, and transit staff, like bus drivers and train operators, would not have to worry about collecting fares, which is a very stressful part of their jobs. So we've heard, I want to remind you that people, particularly racialized people in Toronto, are harassed and intimidated daily by fare inspectors and bus drivers on a TTC. We've heard some of the more famous stories about the black teenager who was pinned to the ground on the St. Clair streetcar, or the woman whose information was collected by an inspector who later used it to ask her out on a date. But if you ride any of the proof of purchase routes on a TTC, you can see that harassment by fare inspectors and even transit operators is a daily occurrence. Why are we using our public resources to crack down on people who are using public transit? The fine for not paying a fare is over $200 and also often requires you to show up in court, meaning you have to miss work. And if you compare this to someone who is being fined for speeding, for example, in a car, it's about 2 or 3 times the amount that they would be fined. So let's take back our public spaces, stop penalizing people for taking public transit, and ensure that these spaces welcome everyone instead of reinforcing existing systemic biases through policing and surveillance of transit users. So where are we now and what do we need for public transit to be possible? One of the major things is political will. So something that is still boggling our minds is that John Tory, in a hugely uncharacteristic move, decided that he was going to make transit free for children 12 and under. So this has definitely been the most successful thing that he's ever done. So I have some numbers to back it up. In 2016, after a full year of this policy taking effect, the ridership of children in Toronto doubled from 11 million to 22 million rides per year. Wow. So why not expand this to include everyone? And on this note, we actually had a couple, well, we have one mayoral candidate in the room, Saran Gebrselassie, who has free transit on her platform, so maybe you can talk to her about that later. Yeah, so political will is a huge part of talking about free public transit and making it possibly a reality. Another thing that we need is to change the funding structure of our transit system massively. So as of 20 years ago, during the tenure of the Mike Harris government, the TTC has been receiving no operating subsidy from the province and is one of the least subsidized transit systems in the world. So most of the TTC's operating funding comes from the fare box, and obviously we need to change this if we want to move towards fare-free public transit. And related to this, free transit would be possible if our transit system is privatized. So this ties into the current musings by Doug Ford and recently the CEO of Metrolinx, who are planning to upload our subways to the province. So this is, we believe, the first step in a sell-off of our transit system, at which point we will have little hope for democratic input into how it's funded or operated. And Metrolinx, with other projects that they've taken on, have already shown that they are exceedingly enthusiastic about P3s, or public-private partnerships. So again, I can't express this strongly enough that free public transit would not be possible if we are dealing with a privatized transit system. And just lastly, another thing that needs to happen is massive expansion of public transit to meet the demand from riders and the surge in ridership. But ironically, one of the largest projects that we've spent money on recently in our transit system is the installation of new fare gates in the Presto system, which originally were supposed to cost $100 million, but currently the cost is at $1 billion and is expected to increase. So it's really about where we prioritize our spending. But with that being said, we also need to challenge the framework of austerity and stop thinking about what we need to cut in order to fund other things that we care about.